The economics of ending an arms race. Here is a question that almost never gets asked out loud. Why is it so much easier to start an arms race than to end one? Building weapons creates jobs, contracts, political careers, entire regional economies. Stopping that machine does not simply remove a danger, it removes a paycheck. It removes a factory's reason to exist. It removes the only skill set thousands of welders, engineers, and machinists have spent their working lives mastering. So when two nations finally sit down to actually reduce their arsenals, the hardest negotiation is not always between the two governments. Sometimes it is between a government and its own defense industry. This is the story of what happens after the treaty is signed. Not the signing ceremony, not the handshake, not the photograph. The part that comes after, when someone has to walk into a factory and explain that the missiles it built for 40 years are no longer needed and somehow convince the people inside that this is not the end of their world. It is a quieter kind of diplomacy. It rarely makes headlines, but it may be the most decisive front in the long, unfinished project of making war less likely. Stay with this one. It does not end with a slogan. The year was 1991. The Cold War, in the sense the world had known it for 4 decades, was unraveling faster than anyone in Washington or Moscow had planned for. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START I, had just been signed, committing both superpowers to cut their deployed strategic warheads by roughly a third. On paper, it was a triumph of diplomacy. In practice, it created a problem that no treaty text had anticipated. Thousands of nuclear warheads, missile silos, submarines, and bomber wings now had to be physically dismantled, and an entire generation of skilled labor on both sides was about to become economically obsolete almost overnight. In the United States, that same year, 2 senators, Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, pushed through a program that history would remember as one of the strangest and most quietly effective pieces of arms control ever enacted, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. Its premise was almost absurdly simple. The United States would pay directly for the dismantlement of Soviet and then post-Soviet nuclear infrastructure. Not because Washington had suddenly become generous, but because an economist working inside the Pentagon's Threat Reduction Office had made an argument that finally cut through the politics. An unemployed nuclear engineer with no other prospects is a far greater security risk than a unionized worker with a pension. Poverty, not ideology, was about to become the primary proliferation threat of the next decade. This is where our story finds its center, in a composite of the engineers and economists who actually lived this transition, on both sides of a negotiating table that had nothing to do with missiles and everything to do with mortgages. Picture a defense conversion office in 1993, somewhere between Washington and the dissolving edges of the former Soviet Union. An American economist, we will call her Mara Voss, has spent 18 months trying to convince a Russian arms plant director, Dmitry Yashin, that closing his warhead assembly line is not an act of capitulation. Yashin has run this plant for 26 years. His father worked the same floor. 3,000 families in his town depend, directly or indirectly, on the paychecks that line generates. He has heard every version of the moral argument already. Weapons are evil. The Cold War is over. The world wants peace. He has stopped listening to all of it, because none of it answers the only question that matters to him. What do my workers do on Monday morning if this line shuts down? Mara does not lead with morality. She leads with a spreadsheet and with physics. She lays out plainly what independent scientific assessments had by then established about the atmospheric consequences of a large-scale nuclear exchange. That the fires from even a fraction of existing arsenals would loft enough soot into the stratosphere to block sunlight for years, collapsing agricultural yields across the hemisphere, regardless of who fired first or who won. There is no market, she tells him, in a world where the wheat does not grow. There is no defense budget large enough to purchase clean water once the reservoirs are irradiated. The plant's entire economic logic, the very thing Yashin is trying to protect, depends on a functioning biosphere that the plant's own product is capable of permanently destroying. This is not a moral argument. It is an actuarial one. And actuarial arguments are the only kind that move people who have stopped believing in slogans. But Mara also does something the purely ideological version of this story usually skips. She does not ask Yashin to simply accept unemployment for the greater good. She brings him a conversion plan, retraining funding routed through the Threat Reduction Program, contracts to repurpose the plant's precision machining capacity for civilian aerospace components, a phased timeline measured in years rather than months, and guaranteed transitional wages for the plant's workforce during the retooling period. She is not asking him to disarm his town's economy. She is asking him to let her help rebuild it into something that does not require the rest of the world to remain frightened in order to stay solvent. Yashin does not say yes immediately. He says something closer to the truth of how these negotiations actually go. That he will believe the retraining money exists when it arrives. That he has heard promises before. That his workers have families and cannot eat hope. This is the turning point the story earns honestly. Not a handshake under triumphant music, but a provisional, skeptical agreement to test the first phase of the plan on a single production line, with Yashin's own engineers auditing whether the conversion funding actually shows up as promised. It does, mostly, not perfectly. Some of the promised civilian contracts arrive late. Some retraining programs are underfunded relative to what was negotiated. The broader history here is not a clean success story. Across the former Soviet Union, defense conversion in the 1990s was uneven at best, and many promised reconversion programs were starved of follow-through as Western political attention moved elsewhere. Entire regions built around Cold War arms production endured genuine economic hardship that incremental, underfunded conversion plans never fully addressed. This part of the story refuses to lie to you. Cooperative Threat Reduction dismantled thousands of warheads and delivery systems that might otherwise have leaked into a chaotic black market during the Soviet collapse. That is its real, measurable achievement, but it did not solve the underlying economic dislocation it was meant to manage. It bought time and reduced danger. It did not deliver a utopia. This is the lesson the economics of arms reduction keeps teaching. Decade after decade, treaty after treaty, ending an arms race is not a single decision. It is a logistics problem, a labor problem, and a trust problem, stretched out over years, vulnerable to political attention spans far shorter than the transitions they are meant to fund. The same pattern recurs elsewhere, with different actors and the same structural shape. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987 eliminated an entire class of missiles, but the verification regime that made both sides trust the eliminations, on-site inspections, data exchanges, agreed destruction protocols took years to build and depended on continuous political investment from both Washington and Moscow to survive. When that political investment eroded decades later, so did the treaty. Arms control, it turns out, is never a permanent state. It is a maintained one, like a bridge that requires inspection and repair long after the ribbon-cutting ceremony is forgotten. What makes Mara and Yashin's story worth telling is not that it resolves cleanly. It is that it shows the actual mechanism by which arms races end, when they end at all, not through moral conversion, not through one side simply choosing virtue, but through a slow, transactional process in which the people whose livelihoods depend on weapons production are offered something real to build instead, and in which the argument that finally lands is not, this is wrong, but this is unsustainable, including for you. Self-interest, properly informed by physical reality, has historically proven a more durable engine of risk reduction than appeals to conscience alone. None of this resolves the deeper tension underneath it. A nation that disarms unilaterally without verified reciprocity does not become safer. It becomes a vacuum that invites exactly the kind of aggression arms control is meant to prevent. Nothing in Mara and Yashin's negotiation argues for unilateral disarmament. It argues for something narrower and more achievable. Verified, reciprocal, economically managed reduction, conducted at a pace that treats the human beings inside the arms industry as stakeholders to be negotiated with, not obstacles to be overridden. That is the actual economics of ending an arms race. It is slower than anyone wants. It is less complete than anyone hopes. And it has, on occasion, actually worked. So we are left, as adults, with an uncomfortable but clarifying truth. The hardest part of disarmament was never drafting the treaty. It was figuring out what to offer the people whose lives were built around the weapons, so that giving them up did not feel like a sentence of poverty. Every successful reduction in nuclear or conventional arsenals in the modern era has depended less on idealism than on logistics, retraining budgets, phased timelines, verification regimes, and a political class willing to keep funding the unglamorous machinery of conversion long after the cameras have left. The hope this story offers is not that arms races will simply stop, or that the industries built around them will dissolve out of conscience. It is narrower and for that reason more trustworthy. That when the economic interests of the people who build weapons are taken seriously, rather than moralized at, negotiated reduction becomes possible in ways that pure idealism never achieves on its own. The biosphere does not negotiate. It simply enforces its limits on everyone, arms dealer and pacifist alike. The only real choice left to us is whether we recognize those limits while there is still time to negotiate around them, or only after they have already been crossed. There is a coda to Mara and Yashin's story worth sitting with. Years later, with the converted production line now manufacturing components for civilian turbines instead of warhead casings, Yashin is asked by a visiting auditor whether he believes, looking back, that the conversion was worth it. He does not answer with gratitude, and he does not answer with regret. He says only that his grandson will likely never learn to do what his own father taught him on that factory floor, and that this loss is real, even if the reason for it is sound. This is the part the tidy version of the story always leaves out. Economic transition is not a morally clean event, even when it moves in the right direction. Something is genuinely lost, alongside whatever danger is reduced. A serious accounting of disarmament has to hold both of those facts at once, not flatten them into a single triumphant narrative. The treaty gets signed in a single afternoon. The economics of honoring it take a generation. That gap, uncomfortable and unglamorous, is where the actual work of peace gets done.